Good evening. The motion before us that colonial institutions explain contemporary national poverty, or contemporary prosperity, more than any other factor we might name. Darren Acemoglu says, extraction built extractive states that could not later be reformed. Niall Ferguson says, British rule built the institutional foundations that made prosperity possible. Both claim history moves through institutions. Both claim the evidence favors them. They cannot both be right about what the 19th century did to the 21st. At the table, three thinkers, each approaching this differently. The empiricist believes most causal claims in the social sciences are artifacts of what we chose to measure, and that the colonial debate suffers from this more than most. We have selected the cases that fit the theory and called it evidence. The geographer believes institutions are abstractions until you name the place, the year, and the people who live there, and that most colonial analysis fails because it generalizes across contexts that were not remotely the same. The essayist believes we are asking the wrong question entirely, that what matters is not what colonialism built or destroyed, but what it prevented from developing, and whether anything can grow in that absence now. The stakes are not historical. 54 African countries, 33 in Latin America and the Caribbean, more than a dozen in Asia, most governed by institutions that took their present shape under colonial rule or in reaction to it. If Acemoglu is right, those institutions cannot be reformed from within. If Ferguson is right, some colonial inheritance was developmental and we should name it. If both are wrong, we have been arguing about the wrong mechanism for 70 years. We are speaking in 2026. Half the world's poorest billion live in former colonies. Whether that is because of what was built, what was destroyed, or what was never allowed to begin is not an academic question. The empiricist will open.
The literature on colonial institutions suffers from a fatal methodological flaw that should disqualify most of its conclusions. We cannot observe the counterfactual. Acemoglu and Robinson claim settler mortality rates determined whether colonizers built extractive or inclusive institutions. The problem is not that the correlation fails to hold in their data set. It holds beautifully. The problem is that the data set contains exactly the cases for which we have settler mortality records, which means exactly the cases where European settlement was economically significant, which preselects for colonies where extraction was profitable enough to generate the documentation we now mine for regressions. We are studying the places where the question mattered to the colonizer. Botswana appears in every defense of the institution's thesis as the African success story. Diamond-rich, stable, democratic, the fastest-growing economy in the world between 1966 and 1999. But Botswana was a British protectorate precisely because it was remote, arid, and economically marginal. The Tswana chiefs retained authority because extracting value was not worth the administrative cost. That looks like good institutions in 1966. It is really lucky irrelevance in 1885. The stronger test is not Botswana against Zimbabwe. It is South Korea against the Philippines. Both were brutally colonized, Korea by Japan from 1910, the Philippines by Spain for 3 centuries, and then America. Japanese rule in Korea was extractive by any measure. Forced labor, cultural suppression, rice exports during famine. American rule in the Philippines built universities, roads, legal codes, the Ferguson package. Korea is rich. The Philippines is not. The institutional explanation collapses. What differs is not what was built in 1910 or 1898, but what happened in 1953 and 1965. Land reform in Korea, none in the Philippines. American opposition to redistribution in the Philippines was not a colonial legacy. It was active American policy during decolonization. We are mistaking Cold War intervention for 19th century institutional path dependence. The falsifiable claim, If colonial institutions explain contemporary outcomes, then countries that were never colonized should cluster around the global median. They do not. Thailand, never colonized, has GDP per capita below every former British colony in Southeast Asia except Burma, which endured civil war for 60 years. Ethiopia, never colonized, remains desperately poor. What we are calling institutional persistence is often just poverty persistence. The question is why poverty persists, not which arrangements in 1880 froze it in place.
The empiricist is correct to find the national unit of analysis wanting. Comparing the GDP of Korea and the Philippines tells us very little about the mechanism of poverty because nations do not have economies, people do, and people live in a particular place. The most powerful colonial institution was not the law or the civil service or the language, it was the cadastral survey. The map of land registration in Kenya, for instance, tells a more honest story about British rule than any constitution. The White Highlands were legally demarcated between 1902 and 1915. That demarcation did not reflect where Kikuyu and Maasai communities had farmed and grazed for generations. It reflected where European settlers wanted to plant wheat and tea. Land was not registered to create a Kenyan nation. It was registered to transfer productive territory into hands that would ship its output to London. This created a specific, enduring economic geography. One or two communities, those who received title and access to credit, became hyper-developed nodes in a global network. The rest of the country became their hinterland, a place to be extracted from. The divergence between the Central Highlands and Turkana County today is not a failure of post-colonial policy. It is the successful, continuing operation of a system designed a century ago. Consider a man named Ekiru Lokere, a pastoralist in Turkana County in Kenya's far northwest. He is not near the old colonial surveyed farmland. To access formal credit, he must present title to land that was never registered because colonial administrators saw no value in registering territory grazed by nomads. Without collateral, he cannot borrow. Without borrowing, he cannot invest in water storage or veterinary care. His livestock die in droughts that wealthier farmers in the highlands survive. The global market has no mechanism to reach him, and the property system of his own country was never designed to include him. Mr. Lacour doesn't lack industry or knowledge of his landscape. He lacks a title deed that was deliberately withheld. His capabilities are throttled by a legal architecture built to serve a ghost. So we are not debating abstract inheritances like common law versus civil law. We are talking about concrete allocations of capital, frozen in place. The argument over institutions is a conversation about software. I am suggesting the hardware is what matters. You cannot reform a cadastral map with a parliamentary vote. The landscape itself has been programmed for extraction, and both the empiricist and the institutionalists have overlooked it.
Both positions rest on the assumption that the colonial period set the decisive parameters, whether through rules that locked in extraction or through physical networks that locked in extraction, and that everything since is downstream of those choices. Neither treats present behavior as independent evidence that might contradict the inheritance story. The clearest signal sits in how labor actually moves. The stock of international migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia has grown faster than the formal employment sectors in receiving countries can straightforwardly account for. These migrants cluster into occupational niches, construction contracting, street vending, rotating savings circles that sit largely outside the licensed, regulated, and taxed economy. They are not failing to find formal work because formal structures are absent. They are choosing arrangements in which enforcement is social rather than legal because social enforcement is the only kind they have reason to trust. The same pattern appears in the limited uptake of formal business registration itself. Survey evidence from the World Bank's enterprise datasets consistently shows that a majority of small firms in lower-income countries operate without registration, even in cities where the registration office is accessible and the fee is modest. The barrier is not procedural ignorance. The behavior shows that entrepreneurs do not expect the licensing apparatus to deliver protection proportionate to the exposure it creates. Operating visibly invites inspection, taxation, and rent-seeking rather than safeguarding property or contract. This is not evidence that colonial institutions or colonial maps are still determining outcomes. It is evidence that populations are treating both the inherited and the newly supplied institutions as optional rather than authoritative. The relevant data is not the volume of rails or statutes left behind, but the volume of economic activity that deliberately avoids them. When that avoidance persists across decades and across different legal inheritances, the explanation must lie in current expectations about enforcement, not in the particular form of rule that existed in 1885. You said, what we are calling institutional persistence is often just poverty persistence. If the mechanism is simply the continuation of poverty rather than any institutional inheritance, why do ruling elites in states that have grown substantially richer since independence continue to withhold credible contract enforcement and independent courts from their own domestic investors at rates that match the behavior of far poorer governments?
You are right that I overreached. The mechanism is not just poverty persisting. It is a specific equilibrium in which current elites find predation more profitable than enforcement. But that is precisely my point. What you are describing is not institutional inheritance, but institutional choice. Nigeria discovered oil in commercial quantities in 1956. By 1970, oil rents were large enough that controlling the state meant controlling the revenue stream. The behavior you are pointing to, withholding credible courts, maintaining discretionary contract enforcement, is not a legacy of indirect rule under Lugard. It is the rational response to an economy where the returns to state capture exceed the returns to productivity growth. The ruling coalition does not need to enforce property rights for domestic investors because it does not need domestic investors. It needs access to resource rents and the international firms that extract them. Here is the question you should be asking. If current behavior is selecting against formal institutions because they are not worth using, why do the same populations consistently demand them in surveys? Are they mistaken about what they want, or are they demanding institutions they correctly predict will never be supplied? You cannot reform a railway map with a parliamentary vote. If physical geography locked in by colonial infrastructure is the binding constraint, why did Meiji Japan, which inherited no colonial railways and built its own network explicitly to connect rice-producing regions to Tokyo and military installations to ports, end up with spatial inequality patterns nearly identical to those in colonially planned systems? What would need to be true about post-independence investment patterns for your thesis to survive that comparison?
The empiricist point on Meiji Japan is an excellent one, and you have caught me in an overstatement. The simple existence of a dominant core and an exploited periphery is not unique to colonialism. It may be a feature of industrialization itself. The accurate claim is about orientation. Meiji infrastructure was built to integrate a Japanese nation-state. Colonial infrastructure was built to disintegrate one, orienting each piece outwards towards the metropole. Consider the Nigerian railway gauge. The British built it at 3/6, narrower than the standard used elsewhere in the world, because it was cheaper to lay across terrain being traversed once, towards a port, not crisscrossed repeatedly between towns. Today, a trader I might call Amara Okafor, moving goods between Kano and Ibadan, finds that this inherited network funnels everything south to Lagos for export rather than laterally between Nigeria's own cities. The system works perfectly. It moves commodities along a 19th-century path calibrated for Liverpool's docks, not for a domestic economy. Post-independence governments poured investment into the same corridors because that is where the freight already moved. Post-colonial investment follows these channels, like water deepening a riverbed. To escape, a state must not only build new infrastructure, but defeat the elites who control the old. The colonial board was not just built tilted, it was tilted towards an exit. The essayist, you suggest that informality is a choice made by people who find the state irrelevant. Let us take that proposition to the coast of Lagos. When the Lagos state government uses colonial-era land titles to bulldoze a community like Otodogbame for luxury high-rises, evicting a fishing family that has lived there since before Nigeria was a country, is that family rejecting the abstract institution of property rights? Or are they being destroyed by the concrete inheritance of a map that never registered their existence, a map now being enforced with lethal precision?
The geographer has identified a case where colonial titles are activated with force rather than ignored. That selective enforcement is genuine. The displaced households, however, do not respond by seeking formal registration elsewhere. They route whatever liquid capital they possess through rotating savings associations. the West African susus and asusus, rather than through commercial bank accounts. Bank of Ghana household survey data from 2017 onward show that cleared peri-urban populations reconstitute these contribution circles within months of displacement, channeling pooled funds into materials and labor outside any formal lending framework. The inherited map therefore serves present-day elite clearance rather than dictating the wider pattern of institutional non-use. What would test the claim is whether those same households later route construction loans through formal banks once the immediate threat passes. Nairobi's slum upgrading program of the early 2010s offered precisely that opportunity. Residents who received official tenure certificates following Mathare clearances overwhelmingly declined to convert that documentation into collateral for bank credit, preferring instead to draw on Chama Group funds at rates that formal lenders could not match for speed or flexibility. They continue to treat both the old titles and the new alternatives as instruments to be evaded when possible.
The question beneath the question is this: if institutions can be reformed when it becomes profitable to reform them, and populations demonstrably ignore institutions when ignoring them is cheaper than using them, then what we are really asking is whether any society can see, from inside its own present arrangements, that it has become the kind of place where reform is now more profitable than extraction, before the crisis that would make that fact obvious has already destroyed the capacity to act on it. We are speaking in 2026. The United States federal government is carrying debt to GDP above 120%. The returns to complexity, the marginal benefit of adding another regulatory agency, another oversight body, another layer of credentialing, are now visibly below the cost of maintaining them. Yet the apparatus continues to grow. The southern border is processing encounters at rates that exceed the administrative capacity to adjudicate claims by roughly 18 months per case, which means the de facto policy is determined by the queue itself, not by law. And approximately 47% of American adults, according to Pew's 2023 survey, report they do not believe courts will enforce contracts impartially if one party is politically connected. So the question is for all three of you: are we inside an extractive equilibrium that looks like institutional sophistication from the inside? What kind? Colonial inheritance, or something we built ourselves? And are we the kind of people who can see it before the thing that makes it obvious also makes it unfixable? The Geographer, you first. You have been talking about landscapes programmed for extraction. 6 counties surrounding Washington, D.C. now rank among the 10 wealthiest in the nation. Is that a geography you recognize?
Yes, I recognize that geography. It is the landscape of a nation that has begun to auto-colonize. The logic is identical, a core that enriches itself by administering a periphery, creating a physical and economic map that serves the administrative center, not the productive hinterland. The difference is that the periphery is no longer in Ghana or the Punjab. It is in Missouri. Consider St. Louis. In 1950, it was the 8th largest city in America. It has since lost more than 60% of its population. This is not creative destruction. It is a hollowing. Let us invent a person there. Call him Darnell. He does not own a cocoa farm. He wants to start a small advanced manufacturing firm, perhaps 3D printing medical components. The resources extracted from him are not raw materials, but something more fundamental, his future. Capital, for instance. A venture fund in California will invest $100 million in an app that helps you rent other people's dogs, but it will not invest $1 million in a manufacturing startup in St. Louis. The geography of investment has shrunk to a few coastal zip codes. The regulations written in the very DC suburbs the host describes, intended to manage the complexity of a continental economy, become a crushing fixed cost on his small enterprise. A barrier to entry that protects large incumbents. The system isn't extracting wealth he has, it is extracting the wealth he might have created. This is what an extractive equilibrium built by and for ourselves looks like. The sophisticated apparatus of law and finance in the capital looks like good governance from the inside. But from Darnell's workshop in St. Louis, it feels like a tax on the possibility of a productive life, levied by a distant, disconnected metropole. The administrative core begins to function like a tumor, redirecting the body's nutrients not for the health of the whole, but for its own non-productive growth. The map of extraction is no longer drawn between empires. It is drawn between zip codes.
The host asks whether an extractive equilibrium can be recognized from within before the costs become irreversible. The geographer treats this as a spatial problem of administrative cores draining productive peripheries. Both frames understate the mechanism that actually transmits the equilibrium across generations. The decisive signal is not where capital or people move on the map, but which obligations they choose to honor once they arrive. In the United States, the number of households holding assets in structures that deliberately limit the reach of domestic courts and tax authorities has risen steadily since the 1990s, even among middle-income cohorts that never cross a state line. These arrangements, series LLCs, captive insurance, and irrevocable trusts, function as private substitutes for impartial enforcement. A 2022 Federal Reserve survey found that among households in the middle two income quintiles, self-reported confidence in receiving consistent treatment from regulatory bodies had fallen below 50% for the first time in the series, a behavioral shift that predates any single administration and tracks the cumulative layering of compliance obligations rather than any discrete political rupture. They are not responses to colonial maps. They are responses to the cumulative expansion of administrative discretion itself. What this behavior reveals, and a single relocated workshop cannot, is that the equilibrium reproduces through the quiet repricing of loyalty rather than through overt resistance. When enough participants treat the formal apparatus as one option among several, the marginal return to further elaboration of that apparatus falls. The system then requires either higher extraction to maintain its scale or a contraction it has no internal incentive to choose. The dynamic is not without precedent. When Ming Dynasty fiscal administrators responded to mid-16th century revenue shortfalls by multiplying surcharges on registered merchants, those merchants progressively migrated transactions into unregistered kinship networks, which reduced the taxable base further and prompted yet more surcharges. The behavioral adjustment preceded any coherent imperial diagnosis of the problem by several decades, and the formal commercial registry never recovered the transactional volume that would have made reform fiscally attractive to those administering it. The United States is not yet at that threshold, but the data show the same portfolio rebalancing already underway. The question is whether the adjustment remains small enough to be reversed by deliberate simplification, or whether it has already passed the point at which simplification itself becomes politically expensive.
The essayist claims households are rebalancing portfolios away from formal institutions. The geographer claims administrative cores are draining peripheries. What both describe is optimization for the participants inside the system at the expense of system-wide resilience, which is precisely what we should expect when monitoring costs exceed enforcement capacity. Here is what we know rather than assume. The U.S. Federal Register has grown from roughly 20,000 pages in 1960 to more than 90,000 pages in 2023. Tax code complexity, measured by instruction length for Form 1040, has increased by a factor of 7 since 1975. The number of federally required occupational licenses has expanded from fewer than 80 in 1950 to more than 1,100 today. Each addition was individually rational, a response to a specific abuse or inefficiency. The cumulative effect is a system where compliance cost scales with organizational size, which privileges exactly the large incumbents the regulations were meant to constrain. Complexity theory in ecology offers the relevant cross-domain pattern. When predator monitoring becomes prohibitively expensive relative to territory size, prey species shift from avoidance to concealment. The threshold is not binary. It is gradual and reversible until it crosses the point where predator populations have adapted to abundant concealed prey, at which point restoring open behavior requires eliminating the predators, not merely reducing monitoring costs. The analogy holds here. When enforcement becomes expensive relative to the volume of transactions, participants substitute formal compliance with strategies that minimize visibility. The essayist's observable signal is the growth in self-directed retirement accounts, holding private placements and offshore domiciled funds. Instruments whose defining feature is reduced reporting obligation relative to their economic substance. The system does not collapse. It continues operating with lower legibility and higher transaction costs borne privately. Where the analogy breaks, natural systems do not contain actors capable of deliberately increasing complexity to advantage themselves. Regulatory capture does exactly this. Dodd-Frank added roughly 400 new regulations after 2008, written substantially by the firms it regulated. Compliance cost for community banks exceeded 5% of assets. For money center banks, it fell below 2%. Approximately 1,500 community banks exited between 2008 and 2020. That is not drift toward concealment. That is active predation through complexity itself. What we cannot yet measure, whether the threshold has been crossed where simplification requires dismantling the beneficiaries, or whether adjustment is still modest enough to reverse by lowering costs. The essayist is right that behavior shows the answer before official diagnosis does.
Institutions endure only when they lower the cost of coordination more reliably than the alternatives people can arrange themselves. That is not a normative claim. It is a description of the threshold at which people stop using the apparatus provided and begin constructing their own. In the past 15 years, the volume of trade finance routed through letters of credit confirmed by banks outside the exporter's home jurisdiction has risen steadily in sub-Saharan and South Asian manufacturing clusters, even after repeated rounds of domestic banking reform. Exporters pay the extra fee because the confirming bank's refusal to honor documents on political or discretionary grounds is rarer than the equivalent risk inside their own systems. That choice is recorded in the SWIFT data and in the balance sheets of the confirming institutions themselves. It shows populations treating formal domestic enforcement as one costly option among others rather than as the default setting. This is not cynicism. It is arithmetic. The historical record shows how old this arithmetic is. When the Ottoman Empire's commercial courts were widely perceived as unreliable for European merchants in the 19th century, those merchants routed transactions through consular jurisdiction and the capitulatory system, a private overlay on top of the formal sovereign apparatus. Historians have dated the consolidation of this parallel system to roughly the 1840s and 1850s. The point is not that the Ottoman courts were uniquely corrupt. The point is that once bypass costs fell below reliance costs, the bypass became the norm, and the formal system was progressively starved of the transaction volume that would have generated the precedent and the revenue needed to reform it. Extraction and atrophy reinforced one another. The same feedback appears in post-independent sub-Saharan legal systems where statutory land registries coexist with customary tenure arrangements that carry more enforcement weight on the ground precisely because they are cheaper to invoke. The geographer argues that physical infrastructure determines who captures value from a territory. The empiricist argues that regulatory complexity eventually becomes its own form of predation. Both are correct and both are describing the same mechanism from different vantage points. When the cost of operating inside the formal system rises, whether through physical inaccessibility, administrative opacity, or simple unreliability, the rational response is substitution. The substitution is rarely dramatic. It accumulates transaction by transaction, contract by contract, until the formal apparatus is technically present but functionally peripheral. This is what connects colonial extraction to contemporary institutional failure more precisely than the simple inheritance argument allows. Colonialism did not merely leave bad institutions behind, it left institutions calibrated to perform one function, resource transfer to the administrative core, while presenting themselves as general-purpose coordination mechanisms. The mismatch between the declared function and the actual function trained generations of users to treat the formal system as a surface to be navigated rather than a resource to be relied upon. That training outlasts the colonial administration by decades. because it is encoded in contracting practice, in which courts people choose for commercial disputes, in which currencies they denominate savings. The threshold at which simplification becomes cheaper than continued substitution is not announced by governments. It is revealed by whether the next generation of contracts still carries the surcharge for external confirmation. When it does, the institution has not yet earned the default.
The essayist is right that people root around institutions that no longer serve them. The empiricist is right that complexity can become a form of predation. The question we are left with is what it looks like on the ground when an entire system is judged to be more predatory than it is useful. It looks like the port of Aktau in Kazakhstan. There, a freight forwarder named Almas spends his days solving a puzzle of physics and trust. His job is to get a container from Western China to Europe without it ever touching the Russian rail network. This is a new problem. For a century, the Eurasian landmass had a simple, legible logistics. Now, that map is a trap. So Almas plots a new one. His container is lifted onto a train with a 1435mm gauge, then onto another with a 1520mm Soviet gauge at the border. At Aktau, it's lifted onto a ship to cross the Caspian Sea to Baku, Azerbaijan, then back onto a train to Georgia, then onto a ship to cross the Black Sea to Romania. Each transfer is a point of friction, a potential failure. Yet this fantastically complex, expensive, and slow route is now judged less risky than the simple one. This is not a vote in Parliament. It is not an entry in the Federal Register. It is the institution of the state being treated as a weather system to be navigated, or a mountain range to be circumvented. The most profound institutional judgments are not written down. They are built out of steel and concrete in the places people flee to.
I entered this debate believing that institutional inheritance was either real or it was not, that the causal chain from 1850 to 2024 either ran through the structures colonialism left behind, or it ran through something else we could name and test. I no longer believe the question is well formed. The moment my mind changed was when the Geographer described Almas rerouting containers around the Russian rail network, and I realized I had been watching populations treat inherited infrastructure not as a constraint, but as information. The route exists. It is not used. That is not path dependence. That is active navigation. What we have been calling institutional persistence is often just the updating speed of collective behavior, lagging behind the speed at which new information arrives. Korean land reform worked in 1953 because peasant expectations about enforcement shifted faster than the landlord class could coordinate resistance. Nigeria's courts remain unreliable in 2026 because elite expectations about impunity update faster than civic expectations about accountability. The structure in both cases is downstream of the belief about what the structure will do. Here is the question this debate should have asked, but did not. Can a society that has correctly learned not to trust its own enforcement mechanisms ever relearn trust faster than the mechanisms themselves decay? Or does the optimal individual response to correctly diagnosed institutional failure always accelerate the failure it correctly diagnoses? We have been arguing about what the 19th century did to us. The better question is what we are doing to ourselves right now, and whether we can see it.